That's for sure. So welcome everyone. Sheila, did you want to say anything on the front end, or are you going to wait for the back, or what's your plan?
I'll do it at the end.
Okay. All right, so welcome everyone. Glad to have you with us this afternoon / early evening, I think on your side. I'm coming from Arizona, so it's 1:30 for me here. This is a great and really relevant topic, so I'm glad to see some folks here participating and coming to learn about it. There's really a lot to cover here. There's many layers to this onion, if you will. So we're going to utilize this time pretty fully today. Because of that, I know it's 90 minutes. I know it's the end of the day. I want to tell you that I will build in just a short brain break at about the halfway point. So we'll have a chance to stand up, stretch, and rest our eyes for a minute, because I know you're staring at a screen, before we wrap things up. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get us started here. But the host disabled screen sharing. I can't share my screen. One moment. There we go. Perfect. All right, so we're going to be talking about de-escalating student behaviors. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of what's happening right now in education with student behaviors, a little bit of background information from the psychology and brain science of where that comes from. And then the second half of our time today will be some tips on what to actually do about that to best support your students. Of course, as mentioned, this is brought to you by Grand Canyon University in partnership with you all. So this is great to be able to work with you today. You already heard about me. Once was more than enough, so let's not do it twice. If you're not familiar with Zooming, I assume you are. Just a reminder to make sure that your name is in there. I do believe very much in being an interactive presenter, so I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to call you by name. I'm going to ask you to talk to me. Otherwise, it's really boring for me just to chat at a computer screen all by my lonesome. So please answer back and participate in those chats. And it's helpful, again, if we have your name there. We are going to utilize a Nearpod today so that we can have some of that interactivity and exchange. So in just a moment here, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will drop that into the chat so that you can join that link and we can engage with each other that way. If you're on your phone, I know we had at least 1 or 2 people on their phone. This is a great way for you to be able to see the slides along with us, even though you may not be able to participate in that way. All right, so we have 20 some people in the room. Tony, I love the background. I also liked the Disney one before that. That was pretty fun. It's always good to have some fun backgrounds. I have my professional GCU background on today for you because, you know, I am a professional here. When I get to join classrooms and I want to be a distraction, I come in with The Simpsons instead, because that makes the kids laugh every single time. And if they don't laugh, then I'm just old. So there's that as well. All right, so if you can please click on that link that I put in the chat, the Nearpod. That'll take you over to that and allow us to engage with one another in that way. All right. Thank you for hopping over there. It looks like we have about 8 of our 20 some participants who are already in the Nearpod. If you can't get in, let me know, and I'll put that back in the chat again in just a minute here. It's a great way, again, to exchange some thoughts and have some collaborative activities so that we can best utilize our time together today. A couple of icons to watch for as we go through this information today. If you see the little thought bubble with the 3 dots, that's a point that I'm going to ask you to be thinking about or reflecting on something. If you see the speech bubble, that's something that I'm going to ask you to respond to either by unmuting and dialoguing with myself and your peers in this training, or by dropping something in the chat and sharing your thoughts with us. So that's really great. I know that I've got a handful of you right now who I have currently on video. If you are comfortable, turning on your video camera, I love to be able to see your face. So I encourage you to do that if you're willing. It's nice to be able to, again, talk to humans and not just your name. So All right, so let's talk about our goals and objectives for this next 90 minutes minus the 7 I've already used. And that is to develop an understanding of why we are seeing increases in student behavior and actions we can take to mitigate those behaviors and build stronger relationships. That's a very robust topic to cover. Thanks for hopping on camera there. Rebecca has a pretty cool background too. I love the fun backgrounds. Our specific objectives here, we're going to increase our understanding of what is happening with students and their emotional well-being today. So we're going to talk a little bit about trauma-informed practices. We're going to talk a little bit about some of those pieces that have occurred for our students and how that's impacting them. We're going to expand our understanding of how COVID has played a part in that for our students. And we're going to identify some actions we can take to de-escalate those behaviors and improve those relationships. This is a great quote here. If you're not familiar with Brene Brown, she's incredible, a wonderful author. But joy collected over time fuels resilience, ensuring we'll have reservoirs of emotional strength when hard things do happen. And I think we could all come to an agreement that what has occurred in education in general, let alone our private lives, as a result of the COVID pandemic has absolutely tested our resilience as human beings and of those around us. It's really made things tough on us and on students as well. So I really want you to pause for a moment here. This is our first thought bubble and really think back about the impact of the pandemic on joy, not only for you, but for the students you serve. I want you to kind of, if you can, mentally rewind a little bit to March of 2020, which seems like eons ago. And think about, how did that feel to you when we first had this information coming out that this COVID pandemic was here and it was going to impact the ability to open schools? And I really want you to think about, what was your response in that first week? What was your gut reaction when you first knew that potentially schools were going to close? And then I want you to try to move yourself forward a little bit and think about what that felt like maybe in that first month as some time elapsed. And then finally, I want you to think about how that has changed for you and your students by the end of the school year and into the summer months. So I know for me personally, I happen to have been on vacation with my family. We were internationally traveling. We were in Ireland in March of 2020. And we're woken up in the middle of the night by a phone call from family saying, you might want to get home. I think they're going to shut down the border. And so there was that initial panic for us as a family and that concern. I have school-age children. What's going to happen here? How are they going to be able to go to school? And then, rushing home and the uncertainty of what was happening. And that first week was really intense. And just like all of you as an educator, I was busy supporting in a variety of ways on how we were going to launch into virtual instruction and what that was going to look like. But for me and my family, I really found that as we moved into that first month, there was a certain amount of peace and tranquility that came into play. Like, I wasn't running to soccer games and play rehearsal and all of those things. Like, we got to be together as a family all day. We really enjoyed that opportunity to take a walk at night so we could get outside and enjoy some fresh air. And so it kind of shifted from this initial panic to somewhat of a welcome and supportive feeling. And then it started to really drag on and become this cumbersome concern. And so we know for our students that they've been through a lot through the result of the pandemic. And for some of them, being home was not a positive thing. It was very difficult for them. For many of them, families were really struggling with what was happening to them. And so it's really impacted where we're at today. So I paused for a few moments on that slide to really kind of frame what we're talking about and remind ourselves of what we've gone through. So let's talk about what's happening to student behaviors. So these are some of the things that we're seeing, and I know you're seeing them in your school district, and you are absolutely by no stretch of the imagination alone in this. We're seeing increases in fighting, a rise in disruptive behaviors. We're seeing more student arguing. We're seeing increases in aggressive behavior. We're seeing some uncommon responses as well, things like crying and hitting and biting from students that would not be the norm, based on their age or previous piece. And then we're seeing some avoidance behaviors as well. Both avoidance behaviors at school and also students who are hesitant to even go to school in the first place. And a lot of that we know is the result of being out of routines. And students love routines. Children settle very, very much into those routines. And so what we often see is that when they fall out of those routines is that resistance and anxiety coming into play. And it's very difficult there. Just had a question in the chat that yes, we are sharing a PowerPoint through Nearpod. So if you've joined us late, I'm going to drop it in the chat again here for all. Please click that Nearpod so that you can follow along with the slides with us. Sorry about that. All right. So we're going to start off our first Nearpod engagement activity with a quick poll here. And I just want you to take a look at that poll. You should be able to respond on your end of, tell me, what are you seeing in your school or your classroom? What types of behaviors are you seeing right now? Great, thank you. I see lots of responses coming in. Give ourselves about another 20 seconds or so, and then on my screen, I know you all don't see the same thing, I don't believe. On my screen, I'm seeing all of your responses come in, and it's a sea of dots. So you're seeing a lot of these things is the response here. We're seeing quite a few of these pieces. I'll share it out with you all so that you can see the results of that as well. So we're seeing a lot of these things on a pretty consistent basis, not just one of them, but many of them in our classrooms. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about why we're seeing these behaviors. Where does this come from? What is this a result of? So there's a term called amygdala hijacking, and this comes out of the work by a psychologist, Daniel Goleman, in his 1995 book called Emotional Intelligence: Why It Can Matter More Than IQ. And so what happens here is that we take a look at the brain, and we take a look at the kind of animal instincts that we are born with as Homo sapiens, if you will, and we know how the brain functions. So normally what would happen for students is that we would have a situation where sensory information is received by the thalamus, which then acts as our brain's relay station. All right, and that's normally going to then relay information to the neocortex. That's the thinking part of the brain, and the neocortex is then going to send that to the amygdala, the emotional brain, and that amygdala is going to produce the appropriate emotional response. But what happens is, when the emotional response occurs, when we feel threatened, when we are under anxiety, that whole process gets hijacked and we jump directly to that amygdala. So in nature, you see that play out in the sense of, I want you to imagine out on the Serengeti that there's, a lion that comes to attack, its prey. And the prey is fortunate enough to escape, and it sort of like shakes it off and moves on with its life because it's this natural response just to do so. We don't shake it off as well. We struggle to be wired that way. And I would argue that a lot of what we're seeing here is the response of students to that fight or flight trigger that has occurred to them as the result of the pandemic. And so they're stuck in that amygdala piece, they're stuck in that fight or flight mentality, and they're really struggling then to get back to utilizing that thinking brain. So we're seeing very emotional responses, we're seeing lots of pent-up anger with that. So even without things like a formal diagnosis of PTSD or an anxiety disorder, that chronic stress tends to lead us to an overreactive fear and anxiety circuit in our brain and makes those other pieces not work quite as well. So all right. There's a second layer here then of something referred to as ACEs. ACEs are our adverse childhood experiences, and there's some really cool research here. On the next slide, you'll have a link that you can utilize as well. Just as a reminder, if you haven't used a Nearpod before, by virtue of accessing it today, you'll maintain access to the Nearpod. I think it's for 2 weeks, so you'll have this information, and I put some links in there for you as well. But so ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, and what we know is that there are typically 3 types of ACEs. And that is abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. And so when students experience these ACEs, it impacts them negatively. So this comes out of some research here from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Again, you'll have some information in there. So this is why we're seeing some students in a position we're not used to seeing them in, because not only were our students from traditional areas of struggle. Students who have traditionally experienced abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction, experiencing trauma, but so are a lot of our other students. And I think that's one of the things that we're really struggling with as educators, is that this is coming a lot out of non-typical students, out of students that we don't necessarily expect this from. And so we're really struggling to understand how to approach that, because we have strategies and techniques that we utilize for our more at-risk populations that we're used to this from, but it's also coming from other groups as well. And we're kind of at a loss with what to do with that. So again, as the COVID pandemic wore on and society continued to feel its impact, again, these were seen by additional people in our group as well. You should be able to click this as a PDF if you'd like. There's some really great information on this slide, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but they've done some interesting research here to talk about the frequency with which these types of issues happen, of these ACEs happen. So we see that physical abuse is a high trigger. Some household dysfunction is a high trigger. And significantly, what these ACEs can tend to lead to is, as you can see, is that as the student gets older, they're at a higher risk of negative outcomes, okay? All of those included there for behavioral issues as well as physical and mental health. And so a little bit of that is what we are seeing right now. All right, so this is going to be our first chance to share some thoughts. So I want you to be prepared for that. That's why we got the speech bubble on there. So let's talk about the impact of COVID on all students. All right, and let's think about what happened here. Well, when the COVID pandemic first came down, for a lot of students, they shifted to zero responsibilities in the first few months of the pandemic. I mean, things really shut down in terms of what we expected of students, because we were trying to figure out how to build that plane in the process. We were trying to figure out how to do instruction in a new way for a lot of our students. Students had fewer responsibilities last year because we were socially distancing them or doing less due to the difficulties of virtual teaching. Many of these kids went home to more trauma, and that ACEs refers back to that piece. And when they did, there was little supervision at home because parents were working. Many of our families didn't have that luxury of being able to be home with their students. And we need to recognize that we are all, and that means students, parents, teachers, admin, medical professionals, we are all operating on our reserves. And I think that's been one of the great challenges for educators, is that we recognize what is happening with our students. The information that I just shared with you all, I don't think there's probably anybody in this room who's going, oh my goodness, Tim, you just told me something I didn't even know about. You realize these things are happening, but they're happening to you too. So it's really tough to pour into that cup of our students at the same time when we're really struggling on our end. We're exhausted, we're worn out. So there's a lot going on in there. I want you to, if you're willing to respond, you can either put it in the chat or you can unmute and respond, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what other events have you seen or experienced with your students that's impacted them? What else are you seeing? I told you I am an educator by trade. I will call on people. It's more fun if we get to talk to each other. Okay, thank you. There's political implications of an election. They have experienced death, absolutely. There have been issues with access to food. Good. Anything else we're seeing? Awesome. Excellent. You all are sharing some wonderful, wonderful things. They're not wonderful things, but they're wonderful thoughts that you're sharing there. So there's been a lot happening. Absolutely. They've become complacent. Excellent. Oh, this group is wonderful for participation. Thank you. I love it. So we've seen a lot going on there. This is just a cool little slide to kind of frame part of what we're seeing is this certain level of immaturity that is frustrating for our students. But take a look at this chart and think about this, that our current 12th graders, their last normal year, if you will, before the pandemic, they were 9th graders, and they're now seniors. And so they're kind of frozen in this multiple year holding pattern. And so they're not responding the way we would normally expect a senior to respond. And we can take that down, down the way here. A 7th grader who might be a middle school student was their last normal year, they were in 4th grade. Our 2nd, 1st, and kindergarten students have never had a normal year. So everything has been impacted by COVID for them in the instructional setting. So we know and understand, why this is happening for them. There's some really great research, and I wish we had more time on it, but I'm going to put the link in here so that you can take a look at it. Bessel Vanderkolk here on trauma-informed practices, and there are 4 parts of this, and I'm just going to give you some quick highlights to think about how trauma impacts students and student learning. Part 1 is the rediscovery of trauma and what that means. Part 2 is this called "This Is Your Brain on Trauma," the minds of children, and the imprint of trauma. So in part 1 of this work, he talks about the fact that trauma distorts the brain's reality. And I think that's a piece that we really need to be cognizant of when we are dealing with students and their issues and distractions that they're currently having in the classroom, because we're struggling to understand where this behavior is coming from. And that is because the traumatic experience that they've been through is distorting their reality. And so their response to things is just not, again, for lack of better terminology, normal from what we're used to seeing. Although not professional therapists, of course, teachers are often in a role of supporting students' emotional health. And so we really have to think about how we help them bear the reality of what's been happening in there. And I know, many schools and many school districts have done a significant amount of work in considering what do we do for social emotional health for students and how do we support that? And that's part of what we're going to talk about later in this presentation. But this researcher would tell us that we can't get better until we know what we know and feel what we feel, recognizing the tremendous courage and strength it takes to remember. And I think that's been part of what's been so complex for us with the pandemic and with the impact that's had on students, is that they don't really know what they're feeling. And they're really struggling to identify that. They're really struggling to put words to that. And the reality is, so are we, because this is something that none of us have really ever been through before. And so you mentioned some things in our chat a few moments ago that are some issues that you're seeing. Things like divorce or self-harm or homelessness or food scarcity. And the reality is, we have people in our system who have experienced that enough that they're a good resource for kids to help walk them through that. But none of us have really ever been through a pandemic like this. And so we're experiencing it with them too, and trying to help them understand what those feelings really represent and what they're going through. All right, there's another speech bubble here, so be prepared to chat again if we could. Because we have one comment here, which I think is a great one, so I want to share it. Because of COVID, students haven't had experiences in large groups of people in a long time. Absolutely. They've lost that social piece. Somebody mentioned isolation earlier. They're really struggling to figure out how to communicate with others around them. And I think it's really interesting, especially for our teens and preteens who, we like to joke about or focus on the notion of technology, and these kids these days, all they do is text each other or Snapchat or whatever, with one another, and that's their only method of communication. And so we would think that when they were shifted to that level of isolation, that they would be able to continue to utilize that tool, and yet it has clearly not been enough for them. So I appreciate the comments there that they're learning those different ways to communicate. Part 2 of this research talks about your brain on trauma. And the key negative cognition for children is powerlessness. And I'm going to pause for just a moment and maybe even say that a second time. The key negative cognition for children is powerlessness. And I think we are seeing so much of that right now. And I think it's really one of the greatest reasons why students are acting out, is because they don't know where to find that power. They don't know how to control the environment around them. They don't understand it. They're struggling to process it. And so they're shutting down and reacting in different ways. The key here is action. Action is the key to healing, as it shuts down that fight or flight survival mechanism signaling safety. So one of the tools that I want to encourage you to consider is, what are we doing to help students take ownership of that power again? How are we helping them create action to process what's happened and to have a sense of control over their choice and their environment again? So that's a really important piece there. So let's talk, if we could put some thoughts in the chat, or if you're willing to unmute, I'd love to hear your voice too. Let's talk about what you're seeing in the classroom today. How is that trauma manifesting itself for your students, and what seems different to you? I'll ask that question again because I asked it quickly. So let's talk about what you're seeing in the classroom today, and how is that trauma manifesting itself for your students, and what seems different to you? Excellent. Okay, good. So a lack of empathy, that's definitely a key one. Disrespect, acting out, less confidence. Excellent. Some really good thoughts there. Complacency, absolutely. Awesome. Extreme reactions to situations. I'm going to show you a slide, a little cartoony slide in just a minute that's going to talk exactly about that. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. I really appreciate them. So part 3 then talks about the minds of children and shares with us that early trauma changes the way the brain is wired, and neither drugs nor conventional therapy has shown the necessary ability to change the brain. Research finds that it's not hostile behavior, but emotional withdrawal that has the most profound and long-lasting impact on children. So let's think about that then. If our youngest learners are most impacted by emotional withdrawal, many of you mentioned in the chat here that that's a lot of what we're seeing going on, both peer-to-peer, but also within the home environment because of things that are going on. So our rational brains can generally override the emotional brain as long as those fears don't hijack us. Remember, we talked about that amygdala hijack. But if we feel trapped, enraged, rejected, then we tend to be vulnerable, and we kind of trap ourselves in that situation there. So think about and just ponder for yourself, what has happened to those emotional connections over this last year and a half? We've lost a lot of them. Students have lost a lot of them in a variety of ways, and we're absolutely seeing the impact of that from our student lens as well as our own personal lens. I think it's been incredibly difficult on everyone to go through that. And then finally, the last part is part 4, is the imprint of trauma. So what does that really do to the brain? Trauma robs you of the feeling that you are in charge of yourself. And man, oh man, I would argue we are absolutely seeing that from the student lens right now. They don't feel like they're in charge of themselves. And you mentioned regulation issues, and that's just really where the struggle is. And it's important for us to understand that traumatized memory is different than the normal memory. It processes things differently. When you're in your normal memory, when you think of events and occurrences in your normal memory, you typically can create a narrative, right? So you have this notion of a beginning, a middle, and an end to the story. It's adaptive. Those stories can be modified when we have those memories. But when we experience traumatic memories, those tend to be fragmented. They're non-social. They don't serve a purpose. And so we feel that kind of loss there. Our students have struggled to make sense of what's happened due to the unprecedented nature of the events and the inability to link that to other life experiences. So that's where they're really struggling right now. So the fundamental issue for us is to restore the balance between the rational and emotional brains so you can feel in charge of how you live. And we're going to talk in the second part here about how we're going to go about doing that. So somebody mentioned earlier an irrational response. There you go, right? Take a minute to look at that graphic. I think it kind of sums it up. Students who came to us, with past trauma on their heart, have now had added to that bad news, the pandemic, and additional stress, as have our educators. And something comes along that would normally have been a minor inconvenience, and it's crushing, right? Because they're so focused on that emotional component of the brain that they struggle with how to respond with it. So I want to take a few minutes here. We're doing great on time, which is excellent. And talk about what accelerated behaviors look like. And we're going to close today with an activity that's going to relate back to this. So I'd ask you to pay special attention to this. So there are 7 phases of escalation, excuse me, that we would normally see. So they're calm, trigger, agitation, acceleration, peak, de-escalation, and recovery. And I'll share a few personal stories with escalation as well as we go through this. I had the privilege many years ago, not many years ago, but several years ago now, I spent 5 years as an elementary principal on a campus that had a cross-categorical behavior program on campus. So we housed that on behalf of the district. We were one of 2 sites that did. And it really gave me an opportunity to learn a lot about how students with behavioral struggles, how students that had experienced trauma, how they processed things in the classroom. And it was really eye-opening to me. And so in getting this information together for you all, this really triggered some things for me, and I relived some experiences that I've gone through. And I think this will resonate with you as well as you think about students and student behaviors that you've experienced as well. So normally we would see students in that phase 1, right? So this is the calm phase, where typically a student is relatively calm and cooperative with us. They're willing to accept corrective feedback. They follow directions. They can set personal goals. They're able to ignore distractions in the classroom. They're able to accept praise, and they're generally on task, right? So this is where we ideally want to see our students all of the time. Some strategies to get us there or keep us there. Classroom structures are important. We know that. High quality instruction is important. We know that. Managing attention or student engagement, that's important. And teaching students behavior, teaching them how we want them to behave in the classroom is also important. So using those strategies are our best tips and tricks to keep our students in that arena of calm. But we know sometimes things will move beyond that, and students will hit that phase 2. This is the trigger phase. And as I go through this, I'm confident that you're picturing a student in your mind when I say some of these things that you've experienced in the past, right? So when we hit that phase 2, students are starting to struggle with unresolved problems, right? They're experiencing conflicts or failure in the classroom. Failure is a huge trigger for students. That can sometimes be triggered by changes in their routine. They may be feeling additional pressure, either directly from the teacher, from peers, or from outside influences. They're struggling with their problem solving, it's ineffective, or they're facing corrective action. And that's probably the one that we're most familiar with in the classroom, is when we have that student who's facing some sort of a corrective action from us, and it triggers a behavior from them. So 3 major strategies that we can utilize to assist with keeping students or mitigating within that trigger phase, are formal programs or services. So these are the curriculums we use. So what social emotional type of curricular support do we use? Something like a Sanford Harmony or other social emotional learning. What interventions do we have in place for students with behaviors? How do we manage and mitigate that within our school system? And the use of counseling type services, social work, or those components. We also can utilize pre-corrective or anticipate and intervene prior to those triggers happening. So when we know that we have students who might struggle with these, we work on the front end to try to avoid getting there. And then we also look at addressing non-school triggers. And I think this is a huge one for us right now as well, which is looking at those parent partnerships and wraparound services. So what are our community partnerships? Again, social workers, those types of pieces that can help support some of those things that you mentioned earlier in the chat that we know are impacting students. Phase 3 then is when we see students move into agitation. And this tends to be, and this is just the world according to Tim, this tends to be, in my opinion, kind of the make it or break it phase. I feel like often if we get beyond phase 3, this sucker's going all the way, and we've kind of lost hope of bringing students back down. So typically when students move into that agitation phase, we see students being off task. We see them questioning authority, arguing, getting out of their seat. They're bothering each other or those around them, or they're socially withdrawing. They're just refusing to connect and engage. It's that kid in the back of the room with their head down, not at all focused or even slightly aligned to what's happening in the classroom. Some strategies that we can utilize to assist us with that agitation phase, that includes focusing on reducing anxiety. So what is it that is getting students that is there? What is adding to their anxiety? Working to act before that escalation occurs. Empathy is a really important tool. And it's a tool that I think we really struggle with when we're exhausted as well. And we are absolutely exhausted right now. So empathy is a piece that we're definitely struggling with. And I also think that one's interesting because of the notion of, to me, empathy is easier when someone is going through something and you are not. Right. So, when you have a student in our classroom and you're like, oh, they've had a terrible, they've had a death in the family. We mentioned that earlier as an easy one for us. And I feel terrible for you. I'm so sorry. I feel for you. But it's a little harder to put that forward if we are also having that death in the family. I mean, we're going through this pandemic as well right now. And so it's a little bit of a struggle to offer that empathy when, there's all of those things going on in their lives, maybe going on in ours as well. So we really have to, I think, focus on that. Some things that can help is to offer movement. And that's a tough one, because when a student has reached that level of agitation and they're already off task and bothering others, our tendency to allow them to have movement to get that out of their system tends to be exactly the opposite, right? We try to hunker down and no, you're going to be in that seat, you're going to be in that corner, you're going to be in that cubby, and that's only lighting a match on that fuel. So we need to think about that, giving them some space, and allowing for choice as well. And when I say allowing for choice, that's not choice in terms of, hey, Rebecca, do you want to participate in this activity? Yes or no? That's not the choice. You are participating in this activity, right? We're not letting students off the hook, but sometimes there are variations in the ways that they can participate in that activity. So maybe it's a matter of, this is a partner activity. Would you like to work with your partner, or would you prefer to work alone? The work's happening, but how would you prefer to do that? And giving them a little bit of that control back can be a helpful piece there. So I'd love to hear some thoughts here on what are some examples of these strategies in action that you have used. What else do you use? Either one of these 6, or what are some other components that you've used to try to mitigate when students are in that agitation phase? Would love to hear your thoughts. And remember, you're welcome to unmute. I love to hear your voices. Good. 5-minute breather. Excellent. Good. Fidget toys can be great. Excellent. You guys are awesome.
Okay, I have a like a question.
Absolutely.
Okay, I really agree with allowing movement. Like, I think that when you said that, it really resonated. But what are
You were talking.
what are some practical ways to allow that for
Okay,
the
that's a good question.
movement? Because in terms of the children leaving the room, in terms of writing a pass, knowing where they are, where are they going? So sometimes I allow the movement by writing the restroom pass. And so I really need some real practical, in terms of middle school age children, and balancing that the responsibility of where they're going. Maybe it's something that we talk about ahead of time.
Great.
But
No, yes.
concern.
So I think there's a couple techniques that you can use here, and folks, feel free to throw in the chat if you have ideas as well. Middle school is near and dear to my heart. That's where I began my career. I think the funny thing about middle school kids is that they desperately want to be wanted as much, if not more, than our elementary kids. So if you have a concern about having them out of the classroom setting, one of the things that I would say is keep for yourself a list of tasks that you need accomplished in the classroom. And again, this goes back to that control piece and that ability to feel control over that. So if you have some things and you can say to a student, hey, I could really use some help with organizing this or cleaning this or moving that, whatever that might be. Would you be willing to help me with one of these things? And give them that opportunity, not just to move, but to move with a purpose. I think that can be very beneficial to them. Another technique that I've seen folks utilize, if you are comfortable with them being out of the classroom, is to have a buddy system set up with a sister teacher, where you might say, hey, if you have a kid who just really needs to get out of the class, I keep this envelope on my desk, and it says, Mrs. Nash, and I go, can you go take this to Miss Nash's classroom for me? She's waiting for it. There's nothing in that envelope other than a blank envelope. But again, it gives the student a purpose. I'm not embarrassing them by saying you need to get out of this classroom. I'm giving them an opportunity to have movement, potentially depending upon the setup of your school. They might also get some fresh air and some sunshine in that process, which can help. So those are a couple of techniques I think you can use that can be very helpful to students. And again, I think if you can incorporate that choice in there, that's very helpful as well. Do others have ideas they want to share? I see a sensory room, which can be great. Fidget bands are awesome. Somebody mentioned earlier those little popping things. Yeah, where were those when I was a kid? Those things are like, that's nice. That really is a nice way to get things out. I mentioned to you at the beginning of the presentation that I have a couple of high school students at home. My wife and I were crazy enough to have a third child, so I also have a second grader at home. We have a nice big gap in between them. And I have my oldest two are girls. My youngest is a boy, and I don't like to stereotype, but he is a stereotypical boy. So we have lots of those pop sockets around the house because focus for him is consistently an issue. So those are some great things to share there. I really appreciate those thoughts. Any others that people want to share? Strategies that you're using that have worked well for you? I see designated space for self-isolation, hands-on activities, or just a quick break. Sensory rooms are wonderful. Someone mentioned that before, but you can even have a sensory space or a sensory tub within your classroom, where you might have some tools for students to be able to utilize. Things like tracing and coloring can be really good. They can help students focus. The last school that I was principal at, we purchased and installed in one of our hallways, our K1 hallway, one of those pathways, where students step on certain steps and do the hops and trace on the wall. We found that to be very useful. You could incorporate something like that in your classroom as well. So lots of good ideas there. Thank you all for sharing them. So phase 4, then, I'm going to move us on to phase 4. Phase 4 gets us to acceleration. So this is, as I mentioned earlier, and I saw Cherie nod her head when I said this, this is where I feel like we've passed that point of no return, and somebody's kind of lit that match, and here we go. And so when we get to that acceleration phase, we typically see the student, this is where they start questioning, arguing, they're making threats, they're non-compliant, they're demonstrating defiance, provoking others, they're deliberately violating the rules, right? They really have ramped this up here in non-response to what we've tried to do. This, I think, is one of the hardest ones for us on the teacher side of things, because one of the most important things here is to try to maintain calm and use respect with the student. And that is so hard to do when they are being defiant in your face right at you, right? I mean, our human tendency is to be like, oh, you want to come at me? I'm going to come right back at you, but we know that that's only going to further provoke action from the student. And so we really have to try to keep that calm in that situation, avoid those acceleration prompts. We're going to, again, do an activity at the very end where you're going to see an example of a teacher who, their response sets the kiddo off for sure. And try to be non-threatening in that approach. Phase 5 then is peak. So this is where we've kind of hit the climax of that behavior in the classroom. We've seen a lot more of this than we're used to seeing in classroom environments. And I've seen this, from personal stories, anecdotal information. I've seen it on the news, where we start to see behavior that's truly out of control, right? We see students running or screaming. This is where kids become physically aggressive. Those tantrums, destroying property, throwing desks around, destroying materials, those types of things. If you've never been through the CPI training, this is one of the pieces that they train you on. But really, when we get to phase 5 and we get to that peak, the most important thing here is that notion that we're really focusing on safety now. At this point, we're not likely to stop the behavior per se. We're just trying to keep that student and the students around them safe. So if that means removing that student or removing others from the classroom, you're going to implement your crisis management strategies here. And you're probably going to be doing some sort of a functional behavioral assessment with those students to figure out what's happened to get them to that place. The next 2 phases are de-escalation. So we're kind of coming back off that mountain now of those behaviors. The student typically has a lack of focus, becomes confused, withdraws. denies their actions or blames others, when they're kind of coming off that emotional peak. Again, we're continuing to evaluate the health and safety of students here. This is really that cool down time where we try to avoid blaming, find an appropriate time to debrief and really talk about that with the student. Debriefing is really important, really, really important. So I'll stop and focus on that for a minute because a lot of times, I don't want to skip ahead, but the next one is talks about how we return them to activity. And a lot of people get frustrated by that because they think about, these behaviors were so terrible. Why are we returning them to the activity? Well, the key here is that debrief piece. The key here is how do we get them in a place where we can work with them to discuss those behaviors, to take ownership of those behaviors, and to collaboratively create a plan moving forward to get them back to where we want them to be, right? And sometimes that response of punishment really is just another trigger. And it's going to ramp up that piece again. So again, I'm not talking about letting them off the hook. I'm not suggesting that they're not responsible for their behaviors, but I'm saying we've got to give them that opportunity to come down enough to be able to get back to that. When I worked at the school that I mentioned earlier, and we had students with diagnosed behavioral disorders, this was a really fascinating thing for me to witness and learn about. Because for those students, I often saw a really emotional response to this. Because when students really get to that peak component, there's so much adrenaline, there's so much energy that pours into that you often see like this exhausted state that comes after. They've literally wiped themselves out. And again, we don't have it on this list here, but I've often seen a lot of remorse in that stage as well, because they're coming back into their rational brain. Remember, we talked about that amygdala. They're coming back off that fight or flight. They're moving back to their thinking brain, and they're back to being able to process what's happened and what they could do about it. So then the last phase is phase 7 is recovery. This is where students typically desire to have some busy work, right? They want to be kept occupied. They tend to subdue their behavior here. I mentioned they want to sleep because they've exhausted energy. Some strategies in this phase focus on returning to normal activities. And again, I know that sometimes feels counterintuitive, like have we punished them enough? That's sometimes is the feeling, have we punished them enough to allow them to come back to normal activities? But that should be our goal. Our goal should be to get them back to normal activities in a reasonable time frame, because what I've seen a lot of, especially wearing that principal hat, is that when we don't get students back to normal activities and they return to that classroom setting, we start this process all over again, because they often come in confused, dejected, and so their ability to be triggered once again is very light, right? It's right there and easy to do. It's important to follow through with those consequences, though. We want them to have accountability for that behavior. We want them to be responsible for their actions. And a wonderful technique, and I don't care if you're 2nd grade, 7th grade, or 12th grade, rehearse problem-solving routines for the future. Work with them on what are we going to do if we experience this again in the future. How are we going to handle that? Well, next time I'm going to, Miss Nash mentioned earlier, that movement piece. In the future, Miss Nash, I really needed to get out of here. In the future, I'm going to ask you if I can run an errand for you. And that's going to be my cue to you as my teacher that I need a moment, I need to get out, and that way I can do that without responding negatively. So those are some of our key pieces. All right. So we have an interactive activity here I'd love to hear from you all on. So there's a question here on our Collaborate board that says, after our discussion of the 7 phases of escalation, what stands out the most to you? I would love to hear your thoughts on that. And this will allow us to share them with everyone. When we complete the collab board, we're going to take about a 3-minute brain break. I'm going to encourage you to get up and stretch and roll your eyes and grab a drink, whatever you need to do. And then we'll come back. So my clock says 2:21. So I'm going to say at 2:25, I'm going to take us through the last 30 minutes, which is going to get us into the action items of what we do about these behaviors that we're seeing in the classroom. So put your thoughts on the collab board, take a stretch if you need to, grab a sip of water, and then at 2:25, we'll move forward. Thank you. All right, I'm going to get us started on our last chunk here, and I'm going to throw a little flattery your way while I'm at it and say this is one of the best groups I've worked with in a while. So kudos to you all. You have some incredible reflective thinking here, and I want to talk about a couple of them before I move us forward. And I hope you don't mind me picking on you a little bit. I don't think it shows names on your side, so I won't mention names, but the need to return kids back to the task. I'm a first-year teacher, and I'm trying to learn the best way to discipline the students while also doing what is best for them emotionally and academically. And so this is what I would say to that. And I always preach this as a school administrator. The purpose of discipline is and should always be to change behavior, right? The goal of discipline is to change behavior. It's not to punish. It's not to reciprocate a negative act, it's to change behavior. So the question first and foremost should always be, how do I get you to do something differently next time than you did this time? So I appreciate you sharing that thought there. A lot of you talked about, the notion of returning to the activity and how to do that, even asking the question of how much time to spend in de-escalation before moving to recovery. I'm going to say that that's a piece too that goes to that student choice, and working with students to say, I'm clear on my expectations. The expectation is that you're going to complete this activity, this assignment, whatever that might be, and work with them to tell you when they're ready for that. So you've shared some really good thoughts there. I'm very impressed. So, all right. So the last chunk here, we did our brain break. I forgot my fun graphic because I left us on the collaborate, but I'm trying to compete with Tony on the cruise. So he looks like he's having a good time. Man, I'd love to go on a cruise again if this thing would go away. All right, so let's spend our last chunk of time here talking about what do we do about it. After all, you're looking at me saying, Tim, that's what we came for. We know these things. What do we do about it? So let's talk about some 6 keys to mitigate here. And again, I think these are all things that you're familiar with, but I think it's good to remind ourselves for them. And that is to focus on relationship building, slow the pace and chunk learning, find ways to celebrate and have fun, create a safe zone, protect your own mental health, and teach self and co-regulation. So those are some things that we're going to talk about in this next chunk here. A couple thoughts that came on the slides here. Oh, gotcha. You should see, if you're not seeing the slides, you should be in the Nearpod. If you're not in the Nearpod, can you not see it? Well, that's a bummer.
I have to toggle back and forth between the Nearpod and the Zoom. So if you are, I'm not sure if you wanted to be sharing your screen or not.
Let's go back to screen share. I understand if you're working on one screen, it's tricky. So you can see my screen. We'll do it that way. We'll do it that way. There we go. Then you can see it this way. All right. So the first piece here is that notion of self-regulation. And I remember that was mentioned earlier in the chat as a piece here. I'd encourage you to think about the notion of co-regulation to help us achieve that self-regulation. And in that, obviously self-regulation is our conscious control of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. But co-regulation is modeling and guiding your students to be in conscious control of their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And this is that notion that we really want to talk about and think about. How do we model that for kids? What does that look like for them in the instructional setting? So, self-regulation is a big, I would say, buzzword. I guess it's buzzword or words. We call it 2 words. I'm not sure. We hope that students will begin with self-regulation, but we often want them to independently ask for a break where they'll start using appropriate coping skills. We teach them when they're at their baseline that they can exhibit those skills when they're calm, but when things get real, we often can't reach for the skills that they've been practicing. That's a lot to ask of kids, to really be able to do that on their own and be able to understand and recognize what that is. So an example of co-regulation then is that notion that we would work to do this with the student. So we talked earlier about some things that you might have in your classroom, and one I've seen before is the notion of like a figure-8 track on the wall, right? You know, just a classic little track here. And one of the ways for students to get themselves back focused is to have an opportunity to take a break and trace that track, right? That's that movement piece that we talked about. So taking the opportunity sometimes to do that with students. I Spy books are a great way for students to focus their attention on something else. And doing those with them can be helpful, you know, to co-regulate and give that example with them. Pulling out a coloring book or other, you know, coloring activity can be useful in helping students with that. The bottom line here is that one of the things that we want to think about is, again, how are we modeling this for students, and how are we including that vulnerability for ourselves as the educator to say, look, I have to do these things too. You know, I have to self-regulate as well. And I'm going to share with you things that I do that are helpful to me, and do them with you so that you don't feel like you're isolated in that situation or scenario. So those are some things that you can do. I'd encourage you to think about examples that you're seeing of students who are struggling to self-regulate, and whether or not some of these techniques might be helpful to them. So there are 10 de-escalation techniques that I'm going to walk you through pretty quickly here, because we're cruising on our time. And it's, what is it 3 hours later for you? You 5:30? It's supper time. You're like, keep going, Tim, I'm ready to eat. All right. So these are the 10 de-escalation techniques we're going to talk about. So first of all, being empathetic and non-judgmental, respecting personal space, using non-threatening nonverbals, keeping our emotional brain in check. We're all nodding because, like, man, that's a tough one. Focusing on feelings. And we're going to talk a lot about that one, because not just the actions that are happening, but the feelings behind them. Working to ignore challenging questions, working to set limits, choosing wisely what we insist upon. Also a struggle for some of our educators for sure. Allowing silence for reflection and allowing time for decisions. So tip 1 here is to be empathetic and non-judgmental. So do not judge or be dismissive of the feelings of a person in distress. Remember that that person's feelings are real, whether or not you think those feelings are justified. And that's tough. That really is tough, because sometimes we're like, you've got to be kidding me, right? I mean, come on. But for many of our students in that situation or scenario, those feelings are very real to them, and trying to respect those feelings and honor them can be a huge piece in being able to support them. Our tip number 2 is to respect personal space. Be aware of our position, our posture, and proximity when interacting with a person in distress. Allowing personal space shows respect, keeps you safer, and tends to decrease a person's anxiety. I think I learned the most about this as an elementary principal, and really thinking about when I was interacting with students who were in distress. I mean, I don't know how much you can tell online. I mean, I'm about a 6 foot tall, 230 pound guy, and for many elementary kids, I'm a big dude. And so when students were in those situations of distress, being able to get down on their level and being able to speak with them eye to eye, and not utilizing my physical presence to be an intimidation for them, but instead, being able to communicate with them on their level was really, really helpful. And when we have students who are in distress and we enter their personal space, we have to think about how we're providing care and explaining what you're doing, so the person doesn't feel so confused and frightened. So, hey, how can I help? This is what I'm here for. This is what I'm looking to do in this moment, because sometimes there's confusion about what your intentions are. Our tip number 3 is to use non-threatening nonverbals. The more a person is in distress, the less they hear your words and the more they react to your nonverbal communication. Again, I'll pause for a moment on this one, because I think this is one for us to really marinate in for a moment, because we get really frustrated with students when we're like, dang it, I told you what to do. I gave you specific directions and you ignored me. And I pause for a moment and say, did they ignore you or did they just not hear you? Because again, if that student's in distress at that moment, there's a chance that they're in that fight or flight mentality and they didn't even hear what you said. So what are other ways that we can cue them with nonverbals that their behavior is out of line, or that their action needs to be redirected or readdressed? Be mindful of your gestures, facial expressions, movements, and tone of voice. Boy, don't we all know that. I mean, it sometimes is the fodder of jokes, if you will, what your face says. But students are great at reading us. They know when we are angry and upset. I love to tell the story sometimes and laugh with folks that when I was a high school student, I happened to have had a teacher that I knew very well because he was my father. And when he was upset, he would have this little vein that would pop out on his forehead. And so, I'd be there as a student in class, and I called him Mr. Fountain at the time, which everybody always thought was funny. And all of a sudden I'd sit down and people look at me and they're like, what's the matter? I go, oh, Mr. Fountain's about to lose it. Because I know that facial expression, right? Here it comes. And our students get to know us in that way as well, right? I mean, they know who we are as humans. We spend an awful lot of time together. And so we need to really think about what are we putting on our face, and what is that communicating to them in that process? Because that can be one of those triggers that we talked about earlier. Somebody mentioned on the collab board of being like, sometimes I don't know what that trigger is. Well, that could be that trigger right there, how you're responding to their behaviors. Our tip number 4 is to keep your emotional brain in check. Again, challenging to do, trying to remain calm, rational, and professional. While you can't control the person's behavior, how you respond to their behavior will have a direct effect on whether the situation escalates or diffuses. And as an administrator, this is what I saw the most. And our scenario that we're going to finish with today is going to talk exactly about this. Our example is going to talk about this, is that I would have a student in my office that was sent up by a teacher. And, when trying to figure out what happened, I would say, okay, like the student was off task, their behavior was not appropriate. What sent them over the edge was how the teacher responded to that. And so it's tough because, we're trying to teach students that behavior is not acceptable, but then we have some responsibility and accountability in how we triggered that and push them to that next step. So keeping yourself in those positive thoughts, like I can handle this, I know what to do. One of our collab board, chats was about a first-year teacher. Give yourself that confidence, first-year teacher. You can do this. You have control. Take a deep breath, and stay focused with them on that. Our tip number 5: focus on feelings. Facts are important, but how a person feels is really the heart of the matter. But sometimes people have trouble identifying how they feel about what's happening to them. So watching and listening carefully for the person's real message. Try to say something like, that must be scary. Supportive words like this will let the person know that you understand what's happening, and you may get a more positive response in that. So talk to them about those feelings. Tell me what you're feeling today. Tell me what's going on with that. And allow them that opportunity to know that even though their action is not appropriate, you understand that it's coming from a place of something being off, right? Tip 6, ignoring challenging questions. Engaging with people who ask challenging questions is rarely productive. When a person challenges your authority, redirect their attention to the issue at hand. Ignore the challenge, but not the person. One of our chat participants mentioned earlier that, politics is the easy example here, right? The challenging question is intended to provoke. And sometimes we struggle because we give in to the response to that challenging question. Like, oh, you want to go there? Okay, and we come right back at them. But what really is the intention behind that and trying to get to that? So bring their focus back to how we can work together to solve that problem. What is really the issue here? Okay, well, let's solve that collaboratively. Our tip 7 is to set limits. I think that's really important. As a person progresses through a crisis, give them respectful, simple and reasonable limits. Offer concise and respectful choices and consequences. A person who's upset may not be able to focus on everything you say, but be clear, speak simply, and offer positive choice first. This is one where many of you probably have used in the past that I use the if-then statements. If this, then that. And you can utilize that in both the positive and negative sense. If you choose to do that, then the consequence will be. If you choose to do this, the reward will be. And be concise with them. Help them understand that on the front end, that there's a action and a response that's going to come with that. And they're going to have some choice in that. And there are times where, as frustrated as it makes us, they're going to choose the negative consequence. That's where we're going to go back to that previous tip and say, well, why? What is the feeling behind that? Why are you feeling like that's a better choice than this one over here? There's something you're looking for. I mean, behavior is all a reaction to filling a need. There's a need that is not being met. And so we're trying to figure out what is that need so that we can help meet that for you, again, to get you out of that emotional brain and back into the logical thinking brain. Tip 8, choose wisely what you insist upon. Ouch, that one stings because it's so true, and yet we do it to ourselves. I'll never forget my very first administrative job was at the high school level. And my first teacher issue as this young administrator was that classic quintessential, I worked with sophomores, the sophomore English teacher who was nailing this kid to a wall because he didn't have the proper heading on his paper. That's criminal, and so here's this kid in this class who's in trouble and struggling academically because they didn't put their name on the paper. And I was like, why is that what we're insisting upon? I mean, what do you really want? Well, I really want the kid to complete this assignment and to fully give their thoughts on it. Well, then that's what we should be emphasizing, not the name on the paper. And I'm not saying that's not important. Obviously, we have to have a name on a paper to be able to give the student a grade. But is that a hill that we're willing to die on? Because that's going to push that student in the wrong direction because we're insisting on something that's really not that productive. So thinking about that flexibility and really trying to work on that and be honest with ourselves about what's really important and essential to us as the educator. Tip 9 is to allow silence for reflection. We've all experienced awkward silences. While it may seem counterintuitive to let moments of silence occur, sometimes it's the best choice. It can give a person a chance to reflect on what's happening and how they need to proceed. I hear this a lot, particularly with special education students. If we're working with students who have issues with processing, especially processing related to language, that could also be some of our English language learner students, our EL students. We often forget to give time for them to really process those words and put meaning to those words and give them that opportunity to think through so that they can communicate back. And again, if we go back to that notion of what's most important to us, sometimes we insist on our response sooner than is really necessary. And so we're forcing an issue where it's not going to be productive for us. And finally, our tip number 10 here is to allow time for decisions. So allow time for students to process and think and share those action steps with us. All right, this is a chance for you to collaborate with us. It's a 3-minute timer on this. And I'm going to ask you, after reviewing those 10 de-escalation techniques, first of all, have you used any of these in the past? If so, which ones? And our second part is, what new strategy would you like to learn more about? So I'm going to start the activity. This is an open response that you can do via the Nearpod. And then I'm going to wrap us up.
Dr. Fountain, is there any way you can put those strategies back up or the techniques up? Because I'm having a hard time remembering all 10 while I'm trying to respond.
Does that get him there?
Yes.
I know it's tricky when we have multiple screens to look at once. If you could see my environment, I actually have 3 of them up right now, trying to keep all of these things going. So I fully understand.
A trick if you only have one monitor though, is if you have a Windows computer, hit the Windows icon on your keyboard and right and left arrow, and then you have 2 screens
Split it, yeah.
at once.
All right, so last couple pieces, and then we're going to wrap up today. So we did well on time. Thank you. Thank you. Just a reminder, those 5 quick de-escalation tips, just to continue to frame your work around that. And so we're going to do a little practice here. It should take us about 5, maybe 7 minutes to do. I'm going to really ask you to unmute and talk to me at the end of this. But we're going to walk through a scenario here that's going to show us those 7 phases that we talked about. And then we're going to finish with talking a little bit about what would we do differently to avoid what we see in this scenario. All right. So here's our scenario. This is a 9th grade art class, right? We should assign roles here and do this like, theater in the round, right? So Emily is a student who the art teacher sent to the office last week for throwing pencils in class. So Emily is a known naughty student, if you will. So stage 1, calm, right? So the student looks calm and ready to work. I don't know why I made that plural for calm, sorry. The teacher's waiting for the class to sit. Stage 2, here comes that trigger. Okay, class, today you will draw your favorite pet. If you don't have a pet, just draw someone else's pet, and underneath the drawing, write why you'd like to spend time with this pet. So Emily already looks upset, angry, and takes a deep sigh. Teacher's response to that: Emily, I don't like that look on your face, and I'm certainly not going to stand for more of your inappropriate behavior and acting like a child like you did last week. Do you hear me? Student starts staring at the teacher. Did you hear me? Are you ignoring me? Now get drawing and follow directions this time, Emily. Emily's response to that: I'm not drawing a stupid pet. Teacher's response: oh, here we go, right? What are we going to insist upon? Oh, yes, you are. Or you're losing privileges again, and maybe even taking a trip to the principal's office. So now we've hit stage 3, right? Here we are into agitation. Emily knocks over the pencils. Teacher's response: now look what you did. Pick those up right now. Emily puts her hands on her head, confused as to what to do. I'll give you till the count of 3 to pick those up. 1, 2. Emily slowly begins picking up the pencils. Stage 4, acceleration. Teacher points at Emily. You're acting like someone half your age. Maybe you'd like to join the 1st grade class at the elementary school. You should be ashamed of yourself. Emily picks up the pencil and waves it at the teacher and screams, leave me alone. We're now in stage 5, peak. Teacher gets right in Emily's face. You better calm down. I'm sure the entire class is sick and tired of your ridiculous behavior. Now apologize to the whole class right now. Student's response: I hate you. Throws the pencil at the teacher, knocks the table over, and runs out of the room. Teacher yelling at the student down the hall. You get back here right now. Where do you think you're going? You better be heading straight for the principal's office. And the student arrives there. That de-escalation and recovery takes place in that principal's office. So I want to use the tools that we learned and talked about today. And again, pretty pleased with the cherry on top. I'm going to ask you to talk to me for one last time, and then I'm going to give you the survey and you get to go home. Say, what would we have done differently here? What tips or tricks could we have utilized?
I think the teacher should have, asked Emily how she was feeling, because she clearly had an unpleasant look on her face, and instead of going that way she did, she should have asked Emily, Emily, how are you today? Is there something you need to talk about? What's going on?
I would have asked her what she wanted to draw.
Yes.
Okay. Good. So, and that speaks to kind of that example I gave earlier of the sophomore English teacher. What is the point? Is the point for her to draw? Is it okay if she draws something other than a pet? So that's a good suggestion. I saw Miss Cruz raise her hand.
I was going to say, I might have started the whole assignment thing with asking who has a pet and start that conversation, because maybe her pet recently died and the whole discussion just set her off, or if you have a pet or don't have a pet but want a pet. I mean, kind of the way you word it sometimes could lead into that discussion. And then like the first woman who spoke, if then she still looks upset, maybe go to the side after the kids have started and have a little side conversation with her, which at that point you could decide if you wanted to give them, a different, what animal would you like to draw versus the pet.
Great.
But you don't know. I know that happened to my son one day. He didn't get in trouble for it, but the teacher got upset with him and his cat had died like the day before.
So you've hit on that notion of an unknown trigger, right? That might have been the trigger for the student and we didn't even realize it. And then we went boom and pushed that button for them. So great. Any others?
Usually if I have a student that I notice the look on,
Right.
we'll do a 1 to 10. How are you feeling today? 1 to 10. If they tell me a 4, then I know I need to regroup and maybe do something different. If they're at a 7, then I may ask, okay, what's up? What's wrong? Before I even get into the lesson. And so we do that, that check-in with the kid, 1 to 10. Tell me how you're feeling right now.
Excellent.
Yes, I completely agree. I hope you can hear me, and my phone is on safe driving, but I'm not driving, I'm parked. I really like the idea of a first then, and kind of what everyone is saying. You could ask the student if there is a different animal she wants to draw, if it is related to an unknown trigger. And that is another way of saying you care without, showing you care without saying, and asking are you okay, and moving into that. But let them think for a minute and give them that time. Say, you know what, if you need to take a few minutes and think of something to draw, we can discuss it, and it's an option. So.
Awesome. I'm hearing lots of those techniques being used, putting choice into that equation. Great. We have one more before I wrap us up. Anybody else? I see a hand
Sure,
raised.
I had my hand up.
Yep.
Yeah.
Scott.
This is Scott. Sometimes students don't like to be confronted in front of the class. So if there's something that you see that's emotionally something going on, sometimes it's good to give them an activity that gets them away after everybody starts, and then have a side conversation about what it is that's going on with them or what their concerns are. Because when you do it in a larger group, it puts the focus back on them when they're in an emotional state. That's all.
No, absolutely. I mean, and we're that way as adults too. I mean, nobody wants to be in front of a group of people and have me go, Cherie, what's wrong with you today? Like, that doesn't feel good. That certainly is going to be a piece there. Good. I appreciate your reflection. So I'm going to finish us with one final activity. Your final takeaway is in the Nearpod here. And it is a final collaborate board here. Just what is your key takeaway? How would you synthesize that information? I believe Ms. Jones wants to share a little bit of information with you in regards to GCU as we wrap up today. Also, you'll see the next slide in the Nearpod is a survey. Love the feedback. If you're willing to take a minute to provide it, I think you can do that after today as well, but I don't want you to forget. It's helpful for me to know how to shape things moving forward. A lot of times we get requests to do similar presentations, and so it's nice to hear what worked well for you. Yeah, so I'm going to shush. As you give your key takeaway, I have Ms. Jones share with you some opportunities GCU has for you. I'll stay on the chat if you want to talk. Otherwise, it was a pleasure working with you today. I hope you have a great evening and that dinner's ready for you soon.
Thank you, Dr. Fountain, and thank everybody for attending on this evening. Hopefully everyone got some great information. I'm sure you did. You all had great engagement in everything just about de-escalating the student behaviors. So as Ms. Brown had mentioned earlier, this was brought to you all by Grand Canyon University. And so Grand Canyon University offers a variety of online degree programs. We offer different programs such as certifications, single courses. We have master's degrees, bachelor's degrees, and also doctoral degrees. And so I put some information in the chat, but we do have a website that you all can check out. And from being a part of LCTA, we do have a partnership where you're allotted different scholarships. For our bachelor's degree programs, if you all know any paraprofessionals, they can get 15% for every individual that is in LCTA, or have family members connected to you all, they can get a 10% scholarship. And also for our master's degree program, there is an 18% scholarship available as well. And so we have different varieties under our College of Education, College of Business, our healthcare, sciences, information technology. There is financial aid available. And so if you want the opportunity, just kind of speak, we can briefly go over some of the different programs we have. I am the local representative, so I am here in Tallahassee, Florida with you all. We can definitely schedule some time and we can connect. And again, I just thank you all for coming out this evening.
Again, we wanted to thank you guys. I saw that Scott jumped on, so I'm going to give him just a second to wrap up at the very end. But we wanted to say thank you to Dr. Fountain for jumping on with us and giving us this wonderful presentation. It was exactly what we were looking for. And Sheila, thank you for bringing this to us from GCU. And Scott, I'm going to throw it to you just to close up with the last minute or so.
Thank you so much. Just getting to the point where I can do this. All right. Hey, just want to say thank you for everyone being here. Everybody give Sheree a round of applause because she's phenomenal. She's doing an amazing job with the PD here in LCTA. Thank you, Grand Canyon, for being here with us and everything. But I just need everyone to understand this, that if you need any additional supports, anybody to stop by, the union is not just about, you know, whenever something comes up and it seems to be a critical situation, but we do want to support you and be able to come by the classroom, talk with you if you have any concerns. I know we've got a lot of experts here that are a part of LCTA that have ideas. We've got some administrators that we know that are former members and stuff, Candace. And so this is a team effort at the end of the day. But to change gears just real quickly with you, I need everybody on this call that is part of Leon County to understand that we're about to enter a legislative session. And we are at a point right now where the district is saying that we're out millions of dollars based off of this family empowerment scholarship, which means that there are minimum funds to do the things, resources at schools, salary increases, you name it, whatever it is, things are getting tighter. And we want to make sure that we do webinars that keep you informed. So please look out for those, be a kind of our legislative PD kind of thing. We're going to partner with FEA on that stuff. But Monday is the Leon delegation. That means that Senator Osley, Representative Schoaf, Ramon Alexander, and Allison Tant, we're going to be across from the Capitol at 4:00 p.m. We're going to rally to go ahead and wear red. And we have a couple of select people that are going to go in to advocate for the things that our public schools and students need. And that's stability right now. So that's why our focus is stabilize our schools. And we are so thankful for folks like yourself and Sheree and all of our members that go ahead and step up and step out. So thank you so much. We have to include parents, students, and everybody. And if you have any questions, reach out to Sheree, reach out to me, answer to the newsletter. I'm caffeinated and ready to go if you haven't noticed. So I'm just excited about the things that are happening, and I really do not want to lose momentum on it. And I really know that everyone feels tired right now. So it's been the longest year and a half. I get it. But this is an opportunity for us to bring hope to everybody, and we want you to be a part of it. So thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Thank you guys for being here. Have a great night.